All right, well, thank you all so much for coming and joining us, Eco 201 folks. So our third milestone is due this week. First of all, I want to say thank you for taking the time to join us tonight. Thank you to those of you who were able to submit your second milestone last week. I know it was a holiday week. And then this happens to be when we have our back-to-back milestones as well. So no, the timing isn't great. So I just want to say I really appreciate all your efforts. I know that your individual instructors do as well. And we just are here to help you succeed and get through this little bit of a hump with the holiday falling right in the middle of all these milestones. So good of you to come and stay on top of your work. And I hope that this webinar tonight helps. But please do be reaching out to your instructor if you're struggling at all. We don't want anybody to fall behind because things do move quickly. And I know with the holiday season, it's not really over. I know Thanksgiving's over, but now we're just into like prepping for Christmas for those of you who celebrate, and it's a crazy time. So thank you for making time for this tonight and for just overall being diligent about your coursework. So our milestone 3 is basically the rest of your paper. So you've done the first 3 sections of your paper, the introduction to the paper and the introduction to your company. You've done the section on supply and demand, and you've done the section on price elasticity of demand. So those 3 sections are done. And you've got 3 more sections, to cover with this last milestone. So it is a lot of critical elements to cover. So that's something to be aware of, to give yourself a little bit more time. But hopefully after doing last week's milestone, you sort of have a process down. You probably already have a lot of resources that you can leverage for this section. You've already dived into the annual report and looked at some of the financials there when you've got the revenue information for your company, read a little bit in the annual reviews, hopefully about your company's business. So you're in a pretty good position to jump in a little bit faster into this milestone, I would hope. So you do have that going for you. So the first section that you're going to tackle here is costs of production. So just like you would think, this is looking at the costs that your company faces. So you're going to look at these broadly. What kinds of things do they have to spend money on to do their business? So if you're doing Starbucks, obviously Starbucks has to buy coffee beans and milk, and they have to hire a lot of people to work in their stores. If you're doing an automotive company, they don't have to buy coffee beans. They have to buy steel, and they have to buy tires and glass and all the other things that go into making an automobile. So you're going to look at what those things are for your company and how the prices for those input items have changed. So, what do coffee prices look like now? How does that compare to 5 years ago? What do steel prices look like now? How does that compare to 5 years ago? What's the trend been? So that's something you're going to be looking at. And then you're also going to be looking at, in that context, the actual total costs that your company has each year. So that's presented to you in the annual report. So when you go to the annual report, which you've already done to get the revenue, you'll see there's the line for the revenue, and then there's another one that's often called cost of goods sold. Sometimes it says cost of sales, I've seen it called. I've also seen it called cost of revenue, but usually it's called cost of goods sold. And that's the first line item in costs. Now, they're not going to break it down by, if it's Starbucks, well, this is how much we spent on coffee, and this is how much we spent on milk. It's just going to be a total line item that includes all of those variable costs. So you'll see the trend in that overall, because you'll see each year, is it going up? Is it going down? How much is it going up? How much is it going down relative to revenue? What does that mean for profit? So you'll see the movement of that line, and you'll be able to tell a story about what that means along with how those input prices have changed. So there's a couple different facets that we want to make sure that you touch on to do a really good job on this element. Otherwise, you're just going to be copy pasting what you find in the annual report and being like, okay, well, look, here are the costs for the past 5 years. So your analysis is going to take it a step further by saying, okay, these are the things they're spending money on. This is how the prices of those things have changed, and this is how it's impacted profitability. So I see a couple questions. Andy asks, does labor costs figure into that? Andy, yes, in COGS, labor costs would figure into that. And next question, are taxes part of cost of production? No, and it looks like Ellen grabbed that question too. So if you look at the financial statement, like Ellen mentions, lower down, you'll see the tax bit. So this is just straight up spending to get your product into a customer's hand or your service. So, you know, the people like the baristas at Starbucks, all the ingredients that go into making their food and their coffee, the rent, things like that. I see some people typing, so I'm just going to make sure I don't miss a question before I move on. So yeah, and actually it's a good thing that taxes aren't included in that COGS line item because we really just want to focus on their costs to make the product. So taxes is, you know, it's important for a company, obviously, but it's a very separate discussion and analysis. Yeah, accounting folks would be taking a little bit of a different approach to look at these financial statements. We really just want to take a look at the stuff that's impacting when we have a discussion about fixed and variable costs. So we'll get to that in a moment. So we just look at everything before you get to the tax bit. So that's pretty much how you're going to tackle this section. So you're going to get your data. This should feel very familiar, kind of repeating some of the steps that you did before. You're getting your data on COGS, and then you're just sort of going to tell a story about it. About, you know, a lot of the times it's going to be increasing, but it's increasing because they might be selling more product or services. So, you know, if General Motors is selling more cars, we would, of course, expect their costs to increase. So it's not always, oh, well, everything that they're buying is getting more expensive because their costs are increasing. So you have to take a look at it from a few different angles to do a really thorough analysis. So those are some things to be aware of when you discuss this section. All right. Oh, yeah, great question. So Alex Smith asks, is the same as total operating expenses? Right. So Ellen makes a point about R&D, so research and development would probably fall under operating expenses, which it's a little bit different than cost of goods sold. So research and development would be like a fixed cost. So you're going to spend something, maybe you're developing a new video game or a new pharmaceutical drug. So, you know, you put a lot of research and development into making those new products, but once you've done that research and development and then you're just producing the product over and over again, that cost to produce the product over and over again would fall under your cost of goods sold. So that's to simplify things. That's how we would advise you to look at it in this case, where operating expenses are going to be more your fixed costs and cost of goods sold is going to be more your variable costs. In real life, in a business, putting together these annual reports, it might not be as neat as that, but it's a good rule of thumb for our purposes here. Well, good. Yeah, Tesla makes your work a lot easier. So Carrie asks, technology. I'm doing Netflix. So Carrie, in your case, and we haven't quite got to that element yet, but that's maybe a good segue. A lot of, obviously, what Netflix does is fixed cost, at least short-term fixed cost. So in a case like Netflix, let's say they produce a new show, because they've got a lot of their own shows now. Once they've filmed a show, for them to show it to 100 people, 100 subscribers, or for them to show it to 1 million subscribers or 10 million subscribers, there's not a lot of difference in cost once they've already created the show to deliver it to more people. Whereas compared to an automobile, if we go back to that example, it's a much different cost to produce 100 cars than to produce 10 million cars. So that's an example of a fixed cost versus a variable cost. So Netflix is obviously one of those where a lot of their stuff would probably fall under fixed costs, especially if you're just looking at in the short term. So they create a season of a show, you know, and then they can broadcast that to as many subscribers as sign up. They get their contract for the rights for someone else's television show. And once they've done that, for however long the contract lasts, that's how much it's going to cost them, whether 25 subscribers watch it or 25 million subscribers watch it. They've paid the amount of the contract. There's not a variable cost. I'm assuming that that's how the contracts are written. But if you want to understand with a company like Netflix, if they're putting some of that where we might consider it a fixed cost under COGS, I would just encourage you to read through a little bit of the discussion of their, it usually comes before the financial statement where they discuss some of that stuff, and it might give you an idea of what they're putting under cost of goods sold. And that way, if you're unsure when you get to the discussion of variable and fixed costs on the second element, how to break things down, you'll have a better understanding. Because yeah, Netflix is kind of a special example, but some others are similar to that as well. All right, so we've sort of talked about this a little bit already with some of the examples that people brought up. But the second element under cost of production is to apply the concepts of variable and fixed costs to the company for informing their output decisions. So like we were just discussing, different companies have different kinds of costs. So some companies are going to be more on the fixed cost side, like a Netflix, and some companies are going to be more on the variable cost side. So you can think of like a landscaping company might have a lot of their variable costs might be the labor that they need, but a fixed cost might be the trucks that they use. So you have to break it down and see which ones those are for your company. So you want to do a little bit of categorization first, and then talk about what that means for their output decisions, which is basically how much they're going to produce and how much they're going to grow. So most companies are trying to grow, but your approach to growing your business might be a little bit different if you have high variable costs versus high fixed costs. So those are the things that you're going to try and look at. And again, the annual reports where they discuss their business might give you some insight into this. And also other research that you do in the company will help give you some insight into how they're managing their costs in their mission to grow, as most companies are generally trying to grow. All right, so I see Sherry had a question about Amazon. Yeah, so Ellen, it looks like Ellen gave you a good example there. So you might also want to talk about, I don't know, maybe is it getting too much to try and talk about their Whole Foods acquisition? I don't want to send you down a rabbit hole, but there's a couple different angles you could take if you want to focus on something. Yeah, Amazon's a tricky one. Okay, I see someone's typing. I don't want to miss any questions about costs before we move on to overall market. Generally, students do a pretty good job here as long as you can clearly divide up the costs into the two categories. Okay, these are some of their fixed costs, these are some of their variable costs, and then take it to that next step about describing how they're going to manage those specific costs to grow and what the difference is between one being fixed and one being variable. All right, I'm going to move on then. I don't see any new questions in. So the overall market section has three critical elements. So the first critical element, I do see a question, so hopefully Ellen can grab that one for me. The first critical element in overall market is asking you to discuss the market share for your company and its top competitors by providing, details on current percentages for each company and describing their trend over time. So market share, the big mix-up that students might run into here, so I want to get you all on the right track, is that sometimes people think that this is stock share price. But market share is more if you took the whole market at a point in time, like let's say the year 2016, and said, okay, the market is worth $1 billion. This market, the market for cars, is $1 billion in sales, let's say. I'm just throwing out a number. And General Motors has 300 million of those billion sales. these numbers are obviously made up. So they would have, percentage-wise, they would have 30% of the market. That's their piece of the pie, so to speak. That would be their market share. And then if you were doing a company like GM, you'd say, okay, well, this is how much market share Ford has, and this is how much market share Chrysler Fiat has, and this is how much market share Toyota and Honda have. And then you'd have that piece of this element, and then you'd look at the trend over time. So you'd look at your company, okay, this is, let's say you got 2016 data. This is where my company was at in 2016 in terms of their market share. Is this more than they had a year ago, more than they had 2 years ago, more than they had 5 or 10 years ago, or is it less than they had 5 or 10 or 1 year ago? You might not be able to find detailed market share data for your company and their top competitors for 5 consecutive years, like you can do with revenue. That just might not be possible. Some well-researched and well-defined markets have that information out there, like automobiles is probably one of them. I know airlines is another one where that kind of data is more accessible. But in other companies, it's just not as easy to find. So you can address the trend over time topic a little less, I don't want to say less explicitly, but you might not have as many data points, and that's okay, because we understand that those data points just might not all be out there available to you. So if you can at least find information from a previous year, from wherever you get a snapshot of the latest market shares that you can find for your company and their top competitors, and then can take a look back at a previous year at the very least, then you would be able to at least talk about the trend over time. So the more information you can get, the better. But we understand that getting 5 consecutive years for your company and all the top competitors might not be possible. So Alex, you probably would have to, you could certainly say that in your paper. So Alex asks how to rate Tesla, as they are 100% share for luxury EV, but about 1% for total auto market. Are they 100% for luxury EV? I mean, I know there's other electric vehicles out there. I don't know if any of them are considered luxury. So you might want to just compare them to the electric vehicle market instead of luxury electric vehicle market. So you can certainly state their market share as being almost 100% on the luxury EV market, and then broaden it, okay, all electric vehicles, because, you know, there's the Nissan Leaf and what is it, the Chevy Volt. And then I think that would probably be your most relevant market than looking at all cars altogether. Yeah, and the new one is, I mean, I'm sure it's still a very nice car. I've never seen the lower priced Tesla, but it's in the $30,000 range, in the 30s. So that one, I don't know if it's considered luxury. Yeah, I think it's about that much. But either way, I think the relevant market for your purposes would be the all electric vehicles. So yeah, that's another thing here. Some students might struggle with, well, what's my relevant market? So like with Amazon, you know, what's the relevant market? Is it just like online sales? You know, do you compare yourself to Walmart, how much they sell online? So you might, you know, you're going to need to make, where it's not super clear, you're going to need to make a judgment call, whether you narrow it down. Like if you're doing Apple, you know, there's going to be a market share for cell phones, but then there's going to be a totally different market for computers. So you might need to look at those separately. Or if you've decided and gotten permission from your instructor to focus on one product line, then you would just focus on that product line here. Okay. So, oh, I'm sorry to hear that about Tesla. I love reading papers about Tesla. I feel like they usually come out really good. I think the fact that it's actually a simple thing to focus on can sometimes make the paper easier. And but I'm sorry to hear that you've had some struggles, Dale. Jod, that is very interesting about Amazon. So Jod says that Amazon makes more money from cloud services than online sales. Who knew? I haven't read an Amazon paper in a while, so. Yeah. All right, so that's your first. Doesn't look like there's any questions about market share. This one is generally pretty straightforward. Once you get, like I said, your company and their competitors, and then a comparison data point, then you can just give a little background info. If your company had increasing market share over time, just maybe talk about what's going on behind that, or if the opposite is true, if they're losing market share, what's going on to drive that? Is it just because there's new competition, or are they just not doing as well because people don't like their products as much? Those are some things to consider. All right. So the next element here is on barriers to entry. So you're going to analyze the barriers to entry for your for the market that your firm is in. So actually, I should reword this now that I'm reading it. But I believe the rubric is better worded than this is probably here. So you're going to take what I would recommend is that you take a look at this video that's linked here, because it is from a chapter that we're going to read in full. That you don't need to read in full to do this, but this does happen to be from a chapter we're going to read next week. But we've got the link here to the video that explains barriers to entry, and you can jump ahead to that chapter just to read this section. There's a lot of stuff we cover in this chapter that you don't need to necessarily use for this portion of your paper. So generally this is enough for students, but essentially what you're going to be doing here is you're looking at the overall market that your firm is in. So if it's Tesla, the electric vehicle market, and you're saying, what are the barriers to entry for a new competitor? Not your company, because your company's already in it, but a potential newcomer to break into this market. What might be keeping them from getting into this market? So the barriers to entry are outlined in our textbook. So you can watch this video and learn more about them there, and read more about them in the chapter. You can also do a little bit of additional research if you don't feel it's enough. But it's a pretty standard economic concept. So some industries, some markets are going to have lower barriers to entry than others. So if you wanted to be like a landscaper, the example that I had, that's a pretty low barrier to entry. I mean, we had like a 12-year-old boy mow our lawn when I was a kid, right? So obviously not a high barrier to entry if some preteen can just get a lawnmower and walk around the neighborhood and mow people's lawns. That would be a very low barrier to entry industry. Whereas, a software industry might have higher barriers because, you need a lot of expertise, you need a lot of startup capital. Other things where there's a lot of patent protection might get in the way. It goes through what all those barriers might be in the link to the video. So you're going to see how those apply to your market. So some of the ones listed might not really apply to your market. So that for that particular type of barrier, it would be low or non-existent. And for others, it might be higher. It just depends on which market you're looking at. See some typing, so I just want to make sure I'm not missing any questions related to barriers to entry. So once you look at the barriers to entry and what each of them means for or what each of them sort of looks like for your market, you analyze that, and then you're going to take it one step further and say what that means for your company. Are they being insulated by these barriers, or are these barriers low enough that they need to worry about competitors coming in and maybe taking away their market share? And then lastly, this element also asks you to use a specific example of a failed or successful entrant into the market to sort of support your point. Even if there are high barriers to entry and there was a successful entrant into the market, the fact, what they had to go through to be successful and maybe why they were the only one who was successful might speak to how high those barriers are. Or if there's failed entrants, similar idea. If there's a lot of failed entrants, it might speak to again, the barriers being high enough that it's difficult to successfully really break into the market. All right, I don't see any questions on that one. But Andy, keep typing your question and we will definitely get to it, whether it's on that topic or a separate topic. Okay, great. So Andy asks, for failed or successful market entry, my company is Anheuser-Busch. So is that like a brand they try to sell? So Andy, no, this would be like a brand new beer company. So, I mean, it doesn't have to be brand new, like within the past couple of years necessarily, but it could be, what was that one? Actually, I think Anheuser-Busch just bought it from San Diego. Like a new brewery, like it's like Goose Island. Or, I mean, you could talk about craft beer in general. I might talk about a specific company that really made a bigger mark. AB InBev tends to buy them. That's what happens in that market if they get big enough. So I don't know how old Goose Island is. The thing is, a lot of them have been around for a while, but even if they've been around for a while, you can say, okay, they finally made it on the national stage. You know, a lot of these craft beers, they stay very local. But if they can kind of break out of that and make it on the national stage, then, you know, that shows that they were able to break into the market, and then AB InBev can snatch them up. Right. And that's another reason why they buy them. So they buy them before they can become a threat. So that, you know, that's kind of an interesting angle for you to talk about too, because of the amount of money that a big company like AB InBev has. They're able to do that. So what does that say about, you know, costs? But, you know, maybe they can't buy a company like Sam Adams. I mean, Sam Adams has been around for a while, but they're kind of inching closer and closer into, you know, being national, and having a bigger name might be an example you could use. Yeah. So, you know, think about what might be a good fit there. But yeah, any little craft brewery, I mean, like if you go to, you know, here, I mean, just here outside of Boston in the past like 5 years, we've had so many pop up, but none of them are really threatening Anheuser-Busch. Rob, this is the second element under overall market section, barriers to entry. And we only have a few minutes left. I'm sorry we didn't get through quite everything yet. We can take hopefully a few extra minutes. I know this is a long one, and you guys have had great questions. But the last one in overall market is asking you to describe the market structure for your firm and analyze how this affects their ability to influence the overall market. So market structure, we're learning a lot about that, obviously this week, where we're introduced to perfect competition, which is most likely not going to be any of your companies because they all have popular brands that we know well, so they couldn't really be perfect competition. Rob B, if you look at, so Rob's asking in the failed company element, that's in the descriptor for exemplary. Yep, to list a successful or failed entrant. If you look in the rubric. If you don't include it in your milestone, you're not going to get marked off. But like I said, if this is something you can include now, we are encouraging you to just, you know, do as much as you can on your milestone. Yeah, definitely look at the rubric. Thank you, Ellen. the full final project rubric, so you always have the end in mind. Yeah. So the market structure is going to be one of 4 types. So there's perfect competition. So that's like, you know, you're a wheat farmer, or, you know, a coal operation. The coal that comes out of the ground is all the same. You can't really differentiate your coal from somebody else's coal. Monopolistic competition, oligopoly, and monopoly, which we cover oligopoly and monopoly in a little bit more depth next week. But if you don't feel that your company fits into monopolistic competition, then you can read up a little bit more on oligopoly and monopoly and skip ahead and see if that's a better fit for you. But we do, there is a table, table 12.1. It's, if you see the page numbers, it's on page 392, like we call out here, that breaks down the characteristics of each of these market structures. So of the four, it says, okay, this is, you know, number of firms, the kinds of barriers to entry that you'll see. So, and it gives you some examples. So that should help you kind of decide where your market falls. And then once you've decided that, you're going to go into a little bit of explanation of what that means for your company. So if your company is in monopolistic competition, they're going to operate very differently than a company that's a monopoly or in an oligopoly. So those are the things that you're going to discuss here. But first and foremost, you really have to say, okay, this is the market structure, and these are the characteristics of the market that show that it's in this kind of market structure. So it's not enough to just say, okay, this is an oligopoly, this market. You have to say this is an oligopoly because we see X, Y, and Z. We see these characteristics that fit an oligopoly. And so we've got some outlined here. You can do the four firm concentration ratio. That's one empirical way to show if a market is an oligopoly or if it's more like, or if it's more competitive. So you can link to this here, and that will give you some assistance on how to do that calculation. And then again, just applying the general characteristics of the market structure to your particular market is another way to explain it. All right, we are already at 9 o'clock. I'm just going to say a few things about recommendation, not specifically about each element, but generally students, I feel like, do a pretty good job here, especially on the milestone, and then are able to polish it up a little bit for the final draft. But in each of these things, just make sure that you're referencing back to analysis that you've done in the paper. So in this first element, you're going to be referencing back to things that you found in the supply and demand section and the cost section. In the second element of recommendation, you're going to be referencing back to some of the findings from the overall market section. And in the last section the last element, of the recommendation section, you're going to be referencing back to demand trends and price elasticity of demand. So just make sure to keep that in mind. So if there's something you want to say in terms of your recommendation for the company, it really should be supported by your analysis and your findings. So anything that comes out of left field, even if it's a great idea, if it's not supported, if you can't show the connection to some of your analysis, then it's going to feel like not really connected to the paper. And you might not get full credit if you can't show that connection. Sherry, yes, we will have this posted on YouTube. If you come back to this site, actually, so if you come right back to this Adobe site, there will be a link on the screen to the YouTube channel to find it. And we will also share out the link to this exact recording with all the instructors so that they can post it in your course. All right. But does anybody have any last minute questions? We are a couple minutes over, but thank you 202 students for being patient with us. Oh, Sherry, I'm sorry to hear that, that you missed it. All right, well, thank you all so much. And 202 students, welcome, and thank you for your patience. I'm going to pull up our document. Make sure I get the right one. All right. You all hopefully have a slightly easier time than our 201 students. Your milestone this week is not quite as long as theirs. For those of you who have already taken 201, maybe you remember. Oh, writer's block. I know it's the worst. I'm actually not. I don't feel like I'm like the best writer. It's always been a struggle for me too as a student. I was always that student who would pull an all-nighter the night before because I just could never get the words down. So I sympathize, guys. Trust me, I do. All right. So I don't know if any of your instructors have talked to you guys, but the Fed chair stepped down. Now, probably none of you are including 2017 in your analysis because 2017 isn't over, so nobody should have selected 2017 for their time period, but interesting things going on in the world of monetary policy. So obviously no one's going to be writing about that in their papers, but still it's good to have a nice current event to be thinking about this stuff with while we write our more historical looking papers. So we are obviously learning about monetary policy this week in macroeconomics, and your milestone is sort of a copy of last week's, except instead of fiscal policy, it's monetary policy. So monetary policy is managed by the Federal Reserve, which is the central bank of the United States. Like I said, it's been in the news a lot lately because Janet Yellen, our Fed chair, is stepping down, and she's going to be replaced with someone new with a new administration. So that's all happening. And your job here is to look at monetary policy at the start of your time period and throughout your time period. So monetary policy, like I said, it's managed by the central bank, so it's more focused on the money side of things. So fiscal policy was taxation and spending. This is looking at essentially the money supply and interest rates. So the Federal Reserve's goals are to, the primary two are price stability, so that's inflation, making sure inflation doesn't get too high or too low, and unemployment, making sure unemployment is where we want it to be. So it could, I suppose it could be too low, but generally they're focused on making sure it doesn't get too high. So that's called the dual mandate, price stability and keeping unemployment high. But in addition to that, they also do want to support economic growth and overall financial market stability. So those are their main goals. And they've got some policy tools to help them achieve those goals. And we're learning more about that this week, so I'm not going to go into too much detail on that because that would be a whole, lecture on its own. But you'll be learning more about that as you do your research. Essentially, though, they work through targeted interest rates, open market operations, making certain rules and targets for how they interact with banks. So a lot of that stuff is covered here, but obviously it's covered more in depth in your textbook. If any of that seems confusing to you, reach out to your instructor, see what you can find. YouTube has some great additional resources, and I'm sure your instructor's sharing some additional resources with you to help you understand how a lot of this stuff works. It's getting even more complicated with time, but since you're not all doing, the most recent years of history, so if you're doing the 80s, a lot of the new stuff that the Federal Reserve is doing is things that they weren't doing back then. So for some of you, the newer tools in their policy toolbox aren't applicable. But if you are doing a more recent time period, if you're doing 2000 to 2009, or if you're trying to do all the way up to 2016, so like 2007 to 2016, then you might need to get more familiar with some of the newer policy tools like quantitative easing. But this first element is asking for you to describe monetary policy at the start of your time period. So this is to sort of give us a baseline. You did the exact same thing with your fiscal policy section. This is going to give your overall presentation understanding of this is where we started, so that when you discuss the further actions, you can see how they changed the game. So if their target rate their target interest rate, let's say at the beginning of your time period was 4%, a 4% interest rate. That's obviously not what it is currently, but let's say that that's what it was. That way, when you discuss later on in your time period, let's say it's 3%, we understand that, okay, that's a decrease. So you have some point of comparison. So you're going to sort of lay the groundwork for what it looks like right now, or rather at the beginning of your time period. And we've got some links to potential research sites that might have some information that's useful to you. This is by no means the be-all end-all of what you can use for your research, but obviously the Federal Reserve itself is a great resource. The San Francisco Federal Reserve has a lot of Fed history, and we've got a link to transcripts of meeting minutes for the FOMC. So that's definitely one to check out. If you click this bottom link on this first slide, it will bring you to their site where you can type in any year and you can read the transcripts from the meetings. So that's really insightful. I'm not, Perry, I'm not sure off the top of my head how far back it goes, but I thought it was pretty good when I first checked it out, because I don't know if Ellen, if you know offhand this particular link, the transcripts of the meetings. But like I said, this is by no means the be-all end-all of your research. This is just a sort of a jumping off point. The Shapiro Library is going to be a great resource if you can't find any of this stuff. Sort of like with the presidents, you can also find out who the Fed chair was at the time and then research them. So with fiscal policy, you'd say, okay, this was the president at the time. Let me research the policies that were put in place in that year or the years leading up to it. The Fed chairman would be the person that you might, Google, so to speak. Or if you're going to the Shapiro Library, that might be a keyword that you look up. No, that's surprising to me, Perry. I feel like it had much older stuff than that, but we'll definitely double check. Oh, the San Francisco Lake. That might be the case. But the San Francisco Federal Reserve, I think they also have papers once you're there that might analyze previous policies, if I recall correctly. But again, this is just some jumping off points. The Shapiro Library is obviously going to be a much more in-depth resource for you. And if you're at all unfamiliar with how to use it, my first bit of advice is just type in some keywords and see what you find. And if that doesn't work, or if it's just like you get too many hits and it's too overwhelming and you can't sift through it all, just use the chat with the librarian feature. I've had really, really fantastic luck with that, trying to find stuff for myself. So. I see Ellen is typing, so maybe she checked for me. Okay, cool. So yeah, it goes back pretty far. That last one, the last. And so, of course, this link for transcripts of meetings rather, isn't just for this element. So you can use this to look up, the first year and maybe the year before, the years leading up to the start of your time period. But then you can also use it for the next element, which is going to be looking at the actions taken throughout your time period. So that same link will apply. You can just keep, forwarding through the years and checking out what the Fed was up to. So this is, again, it's going to feel very similar to what you did in your fiscal policy slides. So monetary policy actions, the actions that the Federal Reserve was taking throughout the time period to respond to the economy. So the Fed meets on a very regular basis, and everyone waits on the edge of their seat to see what they're going to say. Sometimes they do nothing and they keep things sort of the same for, maybe a year or years on end. But eventually they're going to make some changes to their policy, whether that's, recently they ended quantitative easing, or if they're just changing their interest rate target, which is another thing that they've done recently. but their decisions are based on what they see happening in the economy. So they sort of act as a counterbalance. So if they see the economy sort of ramping up, they're going to put some contractionary measures on the other side so it doesn't ramp up too fast because they don't want inflation to get too high. And then on the other side, if they see the economy trending downward and maybe heading toward a recession, they're going to put in some expansionary policy to sort of get things going. So you're going to take a look again, those transcripts of the meetings is probably a great place to start, but your other research to see what the Fed was up to, what changes they made throughout the economy and why. So a couple of our models can be used to explain, okay, well, this is an expansionary policy by the Federal Reserve. Why would that help expand the economy? Using these models is a way to help explain that. So why, when we increase the supply of money, is that expansionary? Why, when we increase the interest rate, is that contractionary? So we can use these models that we've linked to here to explain those things, to show in a theoretical way what impact that ought to have on the economy. So Carol shared in the chat that the presidential addresses to Congress have some of this data as well. That's a great place to look. Yeah, I mean, certainly the president and Congress and all that stuff is very separate from the Federal Reserve in terms of decision making, but they would be in the know and be talking about it in those instances, even though they don't actually make the decision. So the Federal Reserve is an independent body, but certainly there's a lot of overlap in terms of what they're trying to achieve, even though they make the decisions independently. Awesome. So that pretty much sums up what you're going to do in policy actions. Some of you are going to have, obviously, same as fiscal policy, more active decades than others. So if you look through their actions and you see, well, they changed their target interest rate a handful of times, but that was it, then that's what you talk about, and you can use the models to show it. Some of you are going to have very active time periods where the Fed was doing a lot. So you don't necessarily have to talk about every little change that was made if that's the case, but you'll want to talk about the big ones, the handful of big ones. So you don't have 10 slides here, but focus on the most important ones if you have a very active policy decade, and make sure that you're spreading them out. So if they did a lot of activity, let's say within a couple of years, you wouldn't just want to cover those couple of years and be like, okay, well, I already talked about 3 of their actions and I'm done. You want to make sure that you also look at what they did earlier in the decade or later in the decade as well, even if it might not have been as impactful, because you just want to be thorough in your analysis of the entire time period. So just think about that as you're balancing what all you cover. Okay, I see Deborah is typing. Thank you, Deborah. All right, I'll keep on going with that. I'm just going to, so Deborah asks, how far in the next decade should we go to show the outcome? That's a good question. I'm not sure that I have a definitive answer for you other than whatever you think is appropriate. I know that kind of gives you too much latitude. I don't think that there's a right or wrong answer. But if you find that there's an impact 5 years from now that you want to include, then include it. I wouldn't say that you're required to go that far, though. But including something like that, if it's truly relevant, is not a problem. But I don't think your instructors are looking for you to go that far into it. And then also, if let's say you're doing the 80s and you're looking at a policy, that the Federal Reserve did in the early part of the decade, obviously the results of that are going to play out within your time period. So hopefully that answers your question. And a lot of sorry, this version of the slide is slightly different. It's more detailed. I believe it's updated in what you all have a copy of. But a lot of the policy impact you can look at, or we'd like you to look at, in also a micro way, so a microeconomic way. So, let's say, the Federal Reserve increases their target interest rate, like they did somewhat recently. What does that mean for businesses? Makes it more expensive for them to borrow. What does it mean for households? It makes it more expensive for them to borrow. So maybe, people aren't buying homes as much, or they're not getting as big mortgages as they might have. Maybe they're not buying cars as much because you have to take out a loan for a car and that's more expensive. Maybe businesses aren't investing as much because the interest rate increased. Things like that. So you can take a look at those impacts that should be a little bit more immediate to address this part. So looking at the outcome and the impact. But there could be things that show up 5 years from now that if you happen to find it, you can discuss it, but aren't necessarily required to do a good job answering this question. Yeah, so Katie, that's a good one. It can be a little bit convoluted. So interest rates, I don't know if you guys want me to get into this because we haven't really gotten to imports and exports and exchange rates in class yet. So I don't want to go over, I don't want to rush ahead, but one of the mechanisms that's impacted by is, so when we increase our interest rates, it makes investing in, like, let's say our treasury bonds more attractive because you get a better return, right? So interest rates, when you're a borrower, you don't want them to be high, but when you're an investor, you do want them to be high. So when we increase our interest rates, more people want to invest in our bonds, all other things equal. So to invest in our bonds at these new higher interest rates, you need to have US dollars. So to get US dollars, you've got to exchange your foreign currency and buy up some US dollars. So that's going to increase the demand for US dollars because more people want to buy our now higher return bonds. So that's going to make our exchange rate higher, which then is going to make our products, our goods and services, more expensive to those same countries abroad. So that's the mechanism. That's one mechanism where it can affect trade, imports and exports. But again, we haven't fully covered all that stuff with exchange rates, so I don't want to really confuse anybody, getting ahead of myself, but hopefully that's not terribly confusing. You certainly aren't expected to talk about that in this element, but if you feel comfortable and you find good information and you want to, by all means, go ahead. We can definitely talk about that here. Yeah, so we are going to have, so like Ellen mentions, we are going to have slides specifically devoted to trends in imports and exports separately once we get to that section. We're going to study that next week. And so those slides will be included for your final draft. But if you want to talk about the impact here that it has on imports and exports, you can go for it, include it. You might just want to save that for those slides. It's up to you, but you might not feel totally prepared to do an analysis of that here since we haven't really fully covered it. So Carol shared something. So she's doing 1966 to 1976. President Nixon opening trade with China was a definite impact on monetary policy for this decade. So yeah, you can talk about any the monetary policy decisions that were made in response to that. Yep. So that would be, if you're talking about how him opening trade with China impacted the Federal Reserve's decision making, then you would talk about that here in monetary policy actions. But once they put those policies into place, then you want to talk about how those policies affected our economy, if that makes sense. And certainly you're going to talk about that whole opening trade with China in your trade slides, which you won't do until the final submission. So that'll be a big topic for you, for sure. Like the 90s folks get to talk about NAFTA. Great. All right, so we've talked a little bit about monetary policy impact. So you can look at it, like I said, on the micro scale. How does it affect, how did these decisions, these policies directly affect businesses and households? And then more generally, how did they affect the overall economy? You know, like we talked about before, was it an expansionary policy? Was it a contractionary policy? So if it's an expansionary policy, we would expect it to help expand, help grow the economy. Did that happen? Did we see the GDP start going up at a higher rate or stop falling if it was in a recession? Did we see unemployment get lower? If it was a contractionary policy, that's usually in response to increasing inflation. Did inflation come down or start leveling off? So those are the things that you can look at, and you already have all that data because you've already collected it all from the first milestone. So that's an easy thing to just kind of bring in here and have a discussion about. And I know I haven't mentioned it much. I feel like a broken record when I say it, but I don't want to not remind everybody. But your main points are going to be on your slide. You can use simple bullets. You can jazz it up a little bit with some PowerPoint smart art and some images if you'd like. You know, it's great to be creative, but still nice and polished and professional looking. But your detailed explanations of each of these main points is going to go in your speaker notes. If you don't include speaker notes, you won't get a passing score for that element on your final project. If you look at the rubric, even if you do a great job on your slide, if you don't include speaker notes, it puts you in the needs improvement category, which on the final is only worth 55% of the points for that element. So that's not a passing score for any given element. So if you didn't include any speaker notes throughout your entire presentation, you would get a 55%. And I don't want that to happen to anybody for just something like that, because it's obviously something you can all avoid. So main points, maybe some nice images or graphics will be on the slide, and the explanation of each of those things in your speaker notes. All right, and as always, I'll scroll down. You will have your reference slide. So at the very least, your reference slide has to include anything you referenced on your slides or in your speaker notes. Your slide, if it's got, it almost definitely will, but at least on most of them, will have some material that you got from a source, right? Because all this stuff is based on research. So anything that you get from a source that you put on your slide is going to have an in-text citation. So, you know, you have a bullet point, and at the end, you've got your parentheses with your in-text citation, just like you would if you were writing something, you know, a paragraph in a paper. And then you're going to do the same thing in your speaker notes. So even if you've cited it on the slide, if you're discussing it and referencing information that you got from a source in your speaker notes, you're going to do the same thing and include that in-text citation with the parentheses. So all that stuff that you've got in your in-text citations needs to show up here on your reference list. Yeah, Carol, that's great advice. So Carol gives some advice about citing images. So if you borrow an image from a site, you know, you can, below that picture, you can just put a little in-text citation in the parentheses. You'll notice that on, you know, when you read a news article, we'll give credit to, you know, if they borrowed an image from somewhere. If you're on a website just reading something, you'll notice they do that very same thing. Yep. So don't be afraid to borrow graphics like that. Some graphics, if you're using something generic, Like if you just go to find an image and they're part of Creative Commons, you don't need to cite it because it's, it's through Creative Commons. But if you're taking a picture of like a current event type of picture that you find from the Wall Street Journal, you would cite that. But if you're just doing a kind of a silly picture of like a cartoon dollar bill that you get from like the Creative Commons licensing, then you wouldn't have to cite that. And if you're at all unsure, we've got great resources here at SNU. The Writing Center and Shapiro Library can help with a lot of citation management if you're not sure about an image or something. But any graph that you get is definitely going to be cited. So if you borrow, although this section of your presentation probably won't include a lot of graphs, but if for any reason you do want to include a graph, a data graph, you can definitely create some graphs to show those models, but those would be ones that you create because they're theoretical. They're not, you're not going to have data points on them, but you're just going to show relationships, sort of like what we discussed in the fiscal policy portion. But if you want to include a graph to show maybe business investment after an interest rate change, you would obviously cite where you got that graph for business investment or whatever it might be. All right. Well, I don't see any other questions. If you do, please share them before I let you all go for the evening. All right. Well, thank you all so much for coming. I really appreciate it. I appreciate all the great questions. If anything comes up between me saying goodnight to you and before you submit this to your course, just be sure to as soon as you can, send your instructor an email, or if they shared their phone number, you can even give them a call. They're happy to answer your questions. I don't want anybody to suffer in silence. I think that's my most painful thing as an instructor, to think about students struggling and not coming to me with their questions, because this is the stuff we love to talk about as teachers of this material. This is our passion. So if you're unsure about anything, how to apply one of these models, is this research relevant? Is this research appropriate? Is this what I'm supposed to be talking about? Just go to your instructor with those questions, then they'll be more than happy to hash it out with you. So please don't hesitate to do that. And